I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to NIICE webinar. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is a research think tank working in the field of international relations, security, and development. Today we are going to discuss the future of Indo-Pacific in post-COVID-19 world order. We have very eminent person to discuss these important issues. Without much delay, let us move to the presentation. We'll have around 10 to 15 minutes for each panelist, and after that we'll open the floor for discussion. The audience can drop their questions in the chat room or on Facebook Live or on Twitter. The first speaker for today is Satoru Nagao from Japan. Dr. Satoru Nagao is a visiting fellow at Hudson Institute. His research area is India Security Cooperation. His PhD is on India military strategy from Gakushuen University, which is a premier institute of Japan. He's also a research fellow at Institute of Future Engineering, visiting research fellow at Research Institute of Oriental Culture in Gakushuen University, research fellow at the Japan Forum for Strategic Studies, associate at Society for Security and Diplomatic Policy Studies, research fellow at Security and Strategy Research Center of Japan, Senior Fellow at Institute of National Security Studies, Sri Lanka, Senior Research Fellow of Indian Military Review. He was also visiting scholar at Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. Furthermore, he was Research Fellow at the Tokyo Foundation and the Ocean Policy Research Foundation in Tokyo. He taught at several universities of Japan, and he was also Security Analyst at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan and First Lieutenant of the Japanese Ground Staff of Defense Forces. He has authored several books and articles on security issues. He is going to speak on a very interesting topic, the US-China confrontation after the COVID-19 crisis. How should Nepal, India, and Japan respond? Over to you, Satoru.
Thank you very much for giving me a chance to make presentation. It is an honor for me. This presentation is the US-China confrontation. How should Nepal, India, and Japan respond? I belong to the US think tank now and analyze the US strategy today. But this is a perspective from Japan. I need to explain why I choose this title. Indeed, US-China competition has been escalating. Next slide, please. Oh, excuse me. Okay, thank you. This is a picture of mine in my think tank. So maybe I'm the good businessman of my working place. In this picture, the Vice President Mike Pence's remark to the Hudson Institute in October 2018 point to the China threat. So before the COVID-19 crisis, the US has already been stepping up pressure on China. Next slide, please. But facing the COVID-19 pandemic, the top priority for the most countries has been halt the spread of the virus. China, on the other hand, continues its assertive military operations throughout the Indo-Pacific region. East China Sea, China increased their military and paramilitary activities at sea around the Senkaku Island of Japan and passed Japanese fishing boats. In Taiwan, China Coast Guard shot in the air and rammed Taiwan's Coast Guard ship from the rear. Hong Kong, China passed a national security law to crack down domestic movement, the democratic movement that is supported by most people in Hong Kong. South China Sea, China was very busy. China sank the fishing boat of the Vietnam. China set up the new district to Gabon, deployed new military planes, entering the EEZ of the Vietnam and Malaysia by using service ship with Coast Guard. China also dispatched aircraft carrier battle groups around Japan, Taiwan, and South China Sea. And another Chinese fleet dispatched near Hawaii provokes the US military planes by using lock-on laser system for their missiles. Indo-China border area, 5,000 Chinese troops entered the Indian side and clashed with Indian force. there are casualties. So all these activities has happened in the COVID-19 crisis. So China sent too many guests to deal with. So now the US is very frustrated. The US is frustrated that China was not only the source of the virus, but also hides the information that ultimately leads to its rapid global spread. And the COVID-19 crisis would undoubtedly affect the outcome of the US presidential election in November. So, and attitude toward China. So now, time has set to escalate more. So therefore, US-China relations are becoming increasingly tense, and countries, including Nepal, India, and Japan, must adapt to the new circumstances. So this raises three questions. What changes should the three countries expect from the escalation? And what problems will the three countries face as a result of this new policy? And how should we respond? So what change should the three countries expect from the escalation? For Nepal, India, and Japan, the most important question influencing long-term planning is, which side is likely to win, China or the US? The United States is now the world's only superpower, a status it acquired by defeating Germany, Japan, and then the Soviet Union. So can we learn a lesson from the history? In the Japanese perspective, Japan has an unfortunate and tragic history of war with the United States. However, for that reason, the Japanese can confidently tell the world not to underestimate the seriousness of US strong stance on China. Before World War II, the US has two war plans for its confrontation with Japan, the Orange Plan and the Rainbow Plan. They were not precisely executed by indicated a general strategic direction. But similarly, the US had the war plans prior to its confrontation with Germany in World War II, which is Black Plan. And when these plans were declassified in 1974, people were surprised because before World War II, the US also had a war plan to confront the British and Canada, which is a Red Plan. With military culture in mind, these plans were justifiable. Therefore, the Japanese take seriously the explicit view expressed by Vice President Pence's remark or national security strategy of US, and believe it. It indicates that US currently has a plan for confronting China. Additional evidence suggests that recent US actions are part of long-term strategy. For the high-tech war between US and China, and the US banned products made by Huawei and ZTE. The process started several years ago during the Obama administration in 2012. The government published a report entitled Investigative Report on the US National Security Issue hosted by Chinese telecommunications companies Huawei and ZTE. So after publishing the document, the US government began to exclude Huawei and ZTE. Thus, recent event and merely part of long-term strategy, which the US has recently been implementing more aggressively. So if so, why has the US recently stepping up its effort? Firstly, China's activities are too challenging. But secondly, now is the best chance the US will get, because the country might only be able to win if it step up now. some simple fact confirmed that now is the best time for the US to pressure China. Next slide, please. Research and development budget. US spend more on research and development. Next slide, please. The US still leads in GDP. And next slide, next one, third one. Thank you. And US spend more on defense. So based on current technology, economic strength, and military balance, it looks like the US would win in the competition with China. Nepal, India, and Japan should not forget the US's advantages as they plan for the future. So what kind of strategy will the US choose? Simply said, militarily, the US will choose a balancing strategy. But economically, the US will make China poor again. The US decide on balancing strategy because China's pattern of expansion in the South China Sea in recent decade. We should consider the recent history of the South China Sea. Japan's Ministry of Defense published a slide that shows why a balancing strategy is best option. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. This slide showed that China's maritime expansion has based on military balance. When France, the United States, and Soviet Union withdrew from South China Sea, it emboldened China. Following each country's withdrawal from the region, China expanded its presence and occupied islands and reefs which the Philippines and Vietnam claimed. Therefore, we must prioritize maintaining a military balance with China. So economically, US will make China poor again. China's problem is problem of money. When China has enough money, it can rapid military modernization. It can rapidly modernize its military. And China's wealth also allows it to invest great deal of money in small countries. The small countries' indebtedness allow China to expand its influence there. Countries with significant China's investment and debt hesitate to criticize China, even if it does not follow international rule. So that is the reason the US will focus on the economy to make China poor again by using trade war as an example. So what problems will the three countries, Nepal, India, Japan, face as a result of this new policy? Militarily, the US has requested that its allies increase their defense spending and sharing security burden. Economically, the US policy will impose sanctions against government officials and companies that trade with China. How should Nepal and India and Japan respond to this situation? In the long run, all three countries will need to cooperate with the United States. Why? Because US will win its confrontation with China. But in short run, however, the country must adapt a new emerging reality. There are two things we should do. First, we should improve our own defense capability. What is Japan doing? Japan is acquiring limited offensive capabilities. It will also import 100 F-35 stealth fighter jets from the United States. It is not only in the US interest, but also the India's interest for India to provide security in the Indian Ocean region. India can also increase its defense capability in the Indo-China border area by using American-made equipment. Indian Army 70 Corps and supported Air Force is a good example. Nepal. Nepal has a long reputation as a provider of strong soldiers called Gurkha. Now is the time for Nepal to expand their presence in the armed force of the US side. Next slide, please. Thank you. Second, we should not depend on China economically. Nepal, India, and Japan can maintain its cooperation with China, but only a short term. In the long run, we must reduce our economic dependence on Beijing if we wish to avoid becoming passenger on a sinking ship. Japan has already started to reduce its dependence on China. So here are some examples. Japan has already ended official development assistance to China. In April, Japan has earmarked $2.2 billion of its record economic stimulus package to help its manufacturer shift production out of China. And indeed, many Japanese companies have relocated their factories in China to Southeast Asia or South Asia. As a result, number of Japanese citizens living in China decreased every year. This is a number compared with the Japanese compared with the Japanese live in the United States. The number of Japanese live in China is decreasing. Thus, the situation will be tough. But even if it's a tough situation, we should be optimistic about this recent development to deal with the situation. Next slide, please. So thank you very much. So this is a cooperation of 4 countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Satoru. Now we'd like to move to the second presenter. Today, the second presenter, Dr. Pankaj Jha. Dr. Pankaj Jha was Director of Research with Indian Council of World Affairs for more than 2.5 years. He had worked as Deputy Director with National Security Council Secretariat from 2012 to 2013 and was closely associated with national security apparatus in India. He has been member of high-level delegation to UK, Israel, and other countries. He has been the visiting fellow with Center for International Studies, International Security Studies, Sydney Universities, and University of South Asian Studies, Singapore. He has also given lecture and participated in high-level dialogue in Germany, Belgium, China, New Zealand, and Australia. He has more than 80 articles, academic papers in both peer-reviewed and non-reviewed journals. He is regularly quoted in international newspaper magazines such as Nikkei Asian Review and others. He has also authored 2 books on India and China in Southeast Asia, Competition of Cooperation, and India and the Oceania, Exploring Vistas of Cooperation. The floor is yours, sir.
Okay, thank you, nice. Nepal, thank you, Pramod, old hand. And hello, my co-panelists. Nice to see you people around. The topic of the day is whether the future of the Indo-Pacific is bright, or should we contemplate a new norm, new narrative, which will be much more acceptable in the changing times. Now, I will use 3 words, very specific 3 words, which will define how Indo-Pacific pans out in near future. The first is the role, the second is resolve, and the third is relief. The role of the major powers with regard to defining the blueprint of the Indo-Pacific. Second, resolve to punish or to accommodate China in the post-COVID-19 phase. And third, with regard to relief, that who provides the relief with regard to economic recessionary trends, which will come on board once the COVID-19 effect subsides. Now the question itself comes about that when we talk about the Indo-Pacific, what kind of a areas, what kind of zones we are really talking about. And I will talk about South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, which fairly being covered by Satoru, and also the Pacific and how things are changing over there. Now, when you look into the Indo-Pacific as a construct, in fact, before I go on, I have my recent book, which is India, Vietnam, and the Indo-Pacific, as recently was published by Routledge, London. And it talks about the utility of the derived regions and how it is really going to work with regard to geostrategic and geopolitical narratives per se as such. Now, the issue is that whether China has been completely castigated, ostracized in the international order, or whether the US has brought about that kind of a trust in which many of the countries can subscribe to this US initiative with regard to Indo-Pacific as such. You look into the developments in East China Sea, you look into the re-election of the Taiwan president, then you look into the South China Sea developments and the impact of Wuhan virus on political and economic structure of the whole of this Asia, which includes a larger part of Indo-Pacific as well. Now, what exactly is really happening is that the role of the international institutions has been in a flux in which they want to play the both sides depending on what exactly is the predominant narrative into it. Interestingly, China has deployed a number of people, number of academics also really bringing forth its own narrative, and while US is doing its own with regard to producing the narratives which it believes is right as such. Now the question really comes into the being that China has been really criticized being the culprit, the global culprit for the spread of the Wuhan virus, which to a large extent is right because of the non-transparent attitude and the resolve that it shows with regard to any neutral and transparent investigation into the matter itself. But the thing is that when you look into the Asian narrative or larger Indo-Pacific, most of the economies are somehow anchored into China in one way or another, being the supply chain logistics provider or the ancillary units to the larger manufacturing hub that the China is really there, because China technically is on the top of the manufacturing ladder. Also, if you look into this US and European nations itself, the big questions comes to the fore that whether these US and European nations can really outwit China and generate the demand which is just required for the ASEAN nations or nations in Indo-Pacific per se as such. Because after this effect of the COVID-19 really ends and their recessionary trend, the employment, the jobs, and the issues related to the economic, political well-being of a human being will be the utmost thing which will be under consideration for the political establishment of the region itself. What exactly it will change will regard to the employment, mental health, lifestyle changes, and the social cultural aspect of it, which technically means a new narrative, new sort of an understanding with the global order will be coming to the fore. Also, if you look into the savings and the investment aspect of it, this is a wild card which has happened in the lives of many of the people. The consumption pattern will be affected, the investment will be affected, and the savings will be slightly higher in the Indo-Pacific region. Also, those activities which are seen as a leisurely, like tourism, arts, culture, paintings and crafts and all those things, will be somehow being deferred for the next 1 and 2 years, and therefore the consumption will be really affected as such. Now, interestingly, what really comes to the fore that Indo-Pacific region, there are two narratives which are competing one against another. The BRI, which everybody is talking about, and Indo-Pacific itself, in which there is a lot of documentary evidence, there is a lot of statements, there is a lot of speeches, but in terms of funding and really outlining the priorities of many of these nations itself, it leaves much to be desired. Now there is a candle which is burning at both ends. One side is the BRI, in which many of the nations might be defaulting with regard to repayment of the loans, while on the other hand, with regard to Indo-Pacific financial support and all those things, they are not very sure what exactly is happening. Now, if you look into the Indo-Pacific and the narrative which is germinating out of it, the one thing which is really comes to the fore that whether Indo-Pacific, just like Asia-Pacific, can provide the institutional support which is required for this type of a construct to really take a longer life or longer shelf life per se as such. Also, it really requires that whether all those statements which is made with regard to the China or the anti-China statements per se do have some substance, or it's just a rhetoric playing to the gallery as such. Also, if you look into the Pacific and if you look into the Southeast Asia, the issue of South China Sea has been at the forefront. what exactly has been the South China Sea was a divisionary thing within the ASEAN is now galvanizing, is putting countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia together on the issue of continental shelf as well as representation in the UN itself, which means some kind of a consensus might be really taking shape within the ASEAN when the next summit really happens under the Vietnam chairmanship. China is paranoid with regard to what kind of a discussion will be happening among the dialogue partners as well as within ASEAN with regard to developments and the post-COVID developments which are going to take shape. However, the issue is that with the China and ASEAN, the total volume of trade is more than $500 billion. Can it immediately scale down, and whether the Southeast Asian countries can find markets which can replace that kind of a volume of trade between China, and whether these production centers will be shifting to countries like Vietnam or Indonesia, or for that matter, other developing economies in the Southern Asia as such. This also needs a little bit of introspection with regard to ASEAN position on the Indo-Pacific. If you look into the ASEAN outlook towards Indo-Pacific, it's very sketchy, and it clearly shows that they see that Indo-Pacific outlook from the ASEAN perspective merely as a fusion of Asia-Pacific and Indian Ocean also, and they see it as dialogue, development, and prosperity, and not of rivalry. However, in one of the sections or one of the points, they clearly outline that maritime domain is one aspect where Indo-Pacific will be constructive and will add some volume to the security architecture which is likely to develop in the Southeast Asia. Now also, if you look into it, South China Sea, everybody is on the brinkmanship. Whether US has the resolve, has the power to really dismantle Chinese militarization or the deployment of those strategic military assets is for anybody's guess, that it is just not being happening, even though both the countries are on the boiling point in South China Sea and also with regard to East China Sea. During this whole phase, there is a new thing which has come to the fore, is Quad 2.0 and its own future as such. There has been some narratives which also said that Quad 2.0 plus is also in the offing. Now, my proposition is that when Quad 2.0 is still in the blueprint phase, then what exactly is the utility of free riders, which includes one ASEAN member, Vietnam, and two dialogue partners, New Zealand and South Korea per se as such. This kind of a narrative, and at a very nascent stage, does put a lot of pressure on issues like Quad 2.0. And also, when you look into this whole, what is really happening in the Indo-Pacific itself, the issue which comes to the fore is whether this whole aspect or whole proposal of Indo-Pacific Economic Corridor is going to take shape. There was also some talk with regard to Blue Dot Network and how issues like infrastructure development and all those things will be seen from the perspective of US, Japan, and Australia. India is still need to really join the bandwagon, and we know that in the past itself, issues like Chiang Mai Initiative and other financial architecture, India was slightly slow in joining these initiatives, and which was in a way that was a policy flaw at that point of time. China also is making inroads into South Pacific, which technically means the whole of the Indo-Pacific is going to be a theater of competition or rivalry between the US and China. The issue is that many of these countries, island economies or countries in Pacific, are shifting allegiance to Taiwan and giving from Taiwan to China itself. One was Kiribati and the other was Tonga itself. And China is again venturing out, making some military bases or a listening post in Tulagi Island in Tonga itself. This kind of development where China challenges the US hegemony in those strategic backwaters where it has never been challenged, also puts stress in different zones. Like in Indian Ocean, India is being stressed out. In East China Sea, China is being stressed out. In Pacific, Australia is being increasingly being challenged. So this kind of a thing, and where US need to reinforce its vision, its objective with regard to both Indo-Pacific and Quad, becomes instrumental in really buttressing the fact that US is there as a prime guarantor, as a sole superpower in this whole construct as such. Now, in a concluding phase, I will really list out the 5 major elements or the factors which needs to be considered for defining the utility of the Indo-Pacific and how the Chinese countermeasures can be effective or ineffective in the post-COVID-19 phase. First, the development of the vaccine and its availability to the masses in the Indo-Pacific region will be a major deciding factor. Who produces first and who provides the first relief again the word relief comes into being, to the masses itself. The second, the ways to avoid recessionary trends and the role that the role the US and the Western powers can play in this context. And third, any military confrontation between China and the US involving either Taiwan, East China Sea or South China Sea would define and chart the future of US, because its credibility will be high on stakes. The future will also depend on if in case US as usual has withdrawn from TPP, it has withdrawn from WHO. If all of a sudden US says that I don't have anything to do with Indo-Pacific in future, God forbid, then whether there's a possibility of an Asian Quad taking shape, taking role, replacing what exactly is the void which has been left by the US as such. Fourth point I want to talk about it is the shifting of production centers. Can the production centers which have been in China can shift in an year or two to different other destinations, which might be lucrative, which might be incentivizing that kind of a shift in production centers? And I acknowledge that Japan has really allocated a large fund for this shift itself. India is also working out with regard to tax incentives and all those things. But the thing is that whether companies will be willing to venture out into the new areas and shift their production centers is for anybody's speculation and how they really think about it. And also the role of the international institutions, where China is dominating and wants to decide and define the rules of the game. Whether China will have to accept the international obligations, responsibilities, and abide by it, or it defines a new rules of the order, which is much more Beijing focused as such. And last, after that I will stop at it, whether there will be a new Cold War or possibility of a rapprochement, again, not between US and China, but US and Russia. Why? Because Russia, I again buttress the fact that Russia wants to regain its own stature, which it has lost to China in early 1990s. It would like to really gain that second power stature, which is there on the wall itself. Also in this whole equation, geostrategic equation, the role of the regional and middle powers will be critical to define the role of the Indo-Pacific architecture, as well as the possibility of buttressing and looking for a futuristic vision for this region per se as such. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Jha. Now we are going to invite Dhruva Jaishankar. Dhruva Jaishankar is Director of US Initiative at Observer Research Foundation and is a non-resident fellow at the Lowy Institute in Australia. Jaishankar was a fellow in Foreign Policy Studies at Brookings India in New Delhi and the Brookings Institution in Washington. His research examines India's role in international system and the effect of global development on India's politics, economics, and society, with a particular focus on India's relation with the United States, the Indo-Pacific, and Europe. His past position, he worked as fellow at Foreign Policy Studies at Brookings India. He was a fellow at Brookings India, Washington. He was a visiting fellow at South Asian Program, yes, Raja Ratnam School of International Studies, Nanyang Technological University at Singapore, Transatlantic Fellow at German Marshall Fund, Washington, D.C., Program Officer of Asia and German Marshall Fund Research Assistant, Brookings Institution, Washington, D.C., and he also worked as a reporter at CNN IBN, New Delhi. He completed his bachelor's from Manchester University, Manchester College, and master's in security studies from Georgetown University. Dhruva has been a David Rockefeller Fellow with the Trilateral Commission and IISS SAIS Merrill Center Young Strategist. He contributes regularly to Indian and international media on security and international affairs. Dhruva, the time is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Jaiswal. Thank you to NIICE for organizing this seminar, and thank you also to the two speakers previously for sharing their insights. I learned a lot from their presentations as well. I'm going to make 3 brief points in my 10 minutes. The first is just on some thoughts on the concept, because I think there's a lot of confusion about the evolution of the Indo-Pacific concept and what it means to different people, because there are different interpretations in New Delhi and in Washington and in Tokyo and in Canberra and other places as well. So that would be my first point. Second, on sort of why it has evolved in some ways as a new framework for thinking about strategic competition in the region. And finally, linking it to the coronavirus pandemic and what the implications might be for that. So firstly, I think there's a common view now, particularly since the Trump administration has embraced this idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific, that this is a US-led initiative. I guess the first point I would like to make to everyone is that it's not. In fact, the US is a latecomer to adopting the nomenclature of the Indo-Pacific and conceiving of it as a strategic framework. And even today, there is still considerable resistance within the US system that is being overcome over time to accepting these new strategic realities and also putting in place, consequently, policies that will flow from that. In fact, I would say the credit for the evolution of at least in its current form, the evolution of the Indo-Pacific as a strategic concept goes back to Prime Minister Shinzo Abe of Japan, who in 2007 made a speech to the Indian Parliament where he spoke about the confluence of the two seas, the Pacific and the Indian Oceans, and the necessity of having to think of these as a single strategic concept. He didn't use the term Indo-Pacific per se, but it was quite clear he was thinking of this at the time. So I mean, this goes back to 2007, although there are even earlier instances of people outside of government using the term in its current form. By 2011, you started seeing in Australian strategic documents, including government strategic documents, the Defence White Paper, this idea of the Indo-Pacific. And for Australia, it made a lot of sense because they have an Indian Ocean coast and a Pacific coast, and the idea of the Indo-Pacific actually puts them at the center. So it made sense in their worldview to adopt this as a framing mechanism. By 2013, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh of India used the term Indo-Pacific in a speech in Japan. And you started seeing from that time on, slowly, it becoming adopted in Indian nomenclature as well. And it was only in 2017 that this started taking root in official circles in the US, and after the first 6 months or so of the Donald Trump administration. The reason I map this out is I think it's quite clear that independently, several countries in the region, and now most belatedly Indonesia, have now adopted this framework as the Indo-Pacific concept. Now, why has this taken place? I think a few things. One is this is simply a reflection of the new strategic realities. China's first overseas military base is in Djibouti. Was set up in 2008. Starting in 2008, China's PLA Navy started doing anti-piracy operations in the Gulf of Aden off the coast of Somalia. And so for the first time, you started seeing in some ways the China playing a role in both the Pacific and the Indian Oceans in a permanent way. And this, in some ways, started, woke up other countries to the notion that this Indo-Pacific, the Indian and Pacific Oceans are a continuum and are a single strategic concept. So today, you have Japan now operating out of Djibouti as well. You have the Indian Navy being more active in the South China Sea and the East China Sea and the Sea of Japan. You have the US, of course, which has permanent facilities in both the Pacific and the Western Pacific and the Indian Ocean. So today, the reality is that this is a single strategic construct, and the nomenclature is simply meant to reflect that change. The second major driver was the inadequacy of existing institutions. So the current political and economic institutions of the broader region were largely date from the Cold War and the immediate post-Cold War period. So the security institutions, which are the US alliance structures with Japan, South Korea, Philippines, Thailand, Australia, as well as the evolution of ASEAN as the central hub, really took place during the Cold War, the late Cold War context, and hasn't evolved significantly since then. Other institutions such as APEC came up in the immediate post-Cold War context, when there was a focus on a sort of narrower concept of Asia that was centered in Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia, and to which the South Pacific, Oceania, Australia, New Zealand, and South Asia and the Indian Ocean region were excluded from this concept. So the institutions that exist today don't accurately reflect this wider scope, and are also simply weaker. They've in some ways were designed for a time and for a situation that no longer exists today. So we see, for example, ASEAN, which was built on a sense of consensus, unable to come up with a single joint position on the South China Sea, even though 4 Southeast Asian ASEAN member states are claimants to the South China Sea. Finally, there's clearly also an inadequacy of norms that has been made clearer from after China's rise and now China playing a more active role on the world stage. And I would say this broadly in 4 areas. One is a lack of transparency about decision making. I think that and the origins of the coronavirus, I think, are a clear indicator of how that has ramifications today for the rest of the world. The second is the unsustainability of some of the economic relationships that have come. So China is today a major, while it is integrated into value chains with Japan and South Korea and parts of Southeast Asia, with many other countries, and not least India and Nepal and most of South Asia, China now has a major trade surplus, which makes less and less sense given that average wages are less in South Asia. So with every country in South Asia, including Bangladesh, Pakistan, China today is a major exporter to these countries, but doesn't actually import very much from these, barring some natural resources. So there's, I think, questions about the sustainability of the economic relationships that every country has formed with China, and whether over time this is actually not mutually beneficial. And this also gets into questions of the sustainability of financing mechanisms and transparency of those as well. So concerns about potential debt rising. A third question relates to territorial integrity and respect. And here it's less, China is not alone in having territorial disputes with other countries and its neighbors, but the question is really about changing, while negotiating in good faith, changing the facts on the ground. And this is what we've seen happen in recent years in the South China Sea, where not only has there been more aggressive territorial claims, as Nagao-san pointed out, but also you've seen the militarization of some of these features in the South China Sea, artificial islands in the South China Sea. Similarly, we've seen greater encroachment and attempts at encroachment into Japan's territorial waters, including just in the past month. And also, of course, disputes on land with India and Bhutan, and we're seeing an ongoing standoff, of course, between India and China there. So that relates to a third point of concern. And the final, fourth and final point of concern relates to global norms and institutions. So various norms that have become more well-established and accepted amongst many countries, whether it relates to internet governance, whether it relates to use of the Arctic and Antarctic, whether it relates to UNCLOS, whether it relates to outer space, nuclear non-proliferation. In all of these areas, we're seeing a gradual erosion of some of these norms that we have all become accustomed to, and which by and large the world has collectively benefited from. So, I think these are the sets of issues that have led to a realization on the part of several countries that more cooperation is needed, particularly amongst countries that have similar viewpoints on these issues, that more cooperation is needed to ensure that China's behavior accords with what their expectations. So this, I think, effectively explains the evolution. I wouldn't see it purely as a zero-sum competition. That is how it is sometimes portrayed. But in fact, I think it is about raising the costs of adverse behavior on the part of China. So all of the countries in question are continuing to engage economically and diplomatically with China. In this sense, it's very different from what we were talking about in the Cold War. But I think raising the cost of adverse behavior and making sure there's a more level playing field, say on the economic front, is in fact the purpose, the explicit purpose of various countries' free and open Indo-Pacific policies, and that's the term that the US and Japan uses. India uses a slightly different term. My final point: what are the effects of the coronavirus on all of this? One is very hard to say, and I think it's we can't accurately predict the future. I'll just point to 4 variables that people should keep an eye out for. One is what will be the future impact of the spread and severity of the virus. At this point of time, South America is the latest hotspot after Europe was badly affected by it. But it is it's quite possible that we will see a slow, continual spread, and particularly as economies, including India's, open up further. And in the US, of course, we haven't yet seen a major decline in the number of cases. The second variable, and this relates to, of course, by the way, what Dr. Jaiswal said about who is first in reaching and being able to develop a vaccine, an effective vaccine to this. The second variable, I think, is how countries recover economically. Every major economy has certain vulnerabilities and has certain strengths. So China has vulnerabilities in terms of investment in manufacturing potential and what it means for that, a slump in that area. For the US, it's mostly the consumption side of things, where it's a consumer-driven economy, and so it's more vulnerable there. So every country, for Russia will be affected by a slump in energy prices and energy exports. So every country will try to play to their strengths, but will also suffer in different ways. And all will have different tools in trying to get out of the recession that will follow. I think expectations, China has already released its figures from last quarter, but we're looking at a 5 to 15% contraction of most major economies, and that will include, of course, the US, India, most of the European economies as well. China's figures were 6.8 for the last quarter. So the different tools will be a combination of fiscal stimulus measures, increased spending by government, monetary stimulus, more printing of money, more liquidity in markets, and also industrial policy measures that will be put into place. So again, different countries will have different strengths. So that, I think, is the second broad variable. The third is what will be the domestic political ramifications. We're already seeing, and I mean, this is not directly related to the coronavirus, but we've seen a lot of protests in the US. This will have some effect, it's unclear what, on the elections in November, but there will be domestic, and there are already domestic political ramifications in many countries related to the coronavirus. So, in Taiwan, you've seen in some ways a strengthening of the position of Tsai Ing-wen, the president there. Other places, there's been Prime Minister Modi has, for now at least, received a surge in popularity. We'll see whether this lasts in India. But there will be domestic political effects for everyone. And finally, I think what will be the security implications of all of this, which is, at least in the near term, we have seen an increase in frictions between China on the one hand and the South China Sea claimant states, and Japan in the East China Sea, and India as well as frictions between China and the US. However, whether this is a temporary or long-term rise in competition or perception of competition remains to be seen. So I think these are the things in that order that I would look out for in terms of how the coronavirus pandemic is going to affect this. Overall, and I'll end on this note, I think so far what we are seeing is pointing to an environment, as the previous two speakers said, of a much heightened US-China competition. Although it will bear certain hallmarks that are reminiscent of the Cold War, there are many reasons, for the reasons I outlined, that it will also have very different dynamics between the US and China, and that will lead to various countries having to make choices. I think broadly what I think we will see is a choice between a sort of more unilateral set of choices that China will drive, and a set of more open, transparent, and sustainable choices that are for different reasons being advanced by other countries. I'll end on that note. Thank you.
Thank you, Dhruva. It was a wonderful presentation. I think I'm not going to summarize the presentation because we have lots of questions. So, to save time, let's move to the question answers directly. First, I'm going to forward 3 sets of questions to all the panelists, and then we'll go with the second set of questions. The first question we have got for Satoru, it's like, America has always been saying that Indo-Pacific is not aimed at everyone. It is rule-based approach for free and fair Indo-Pacific. In Beijing, there is a section that advocates that China should be a part of Indo-Pacific because it is their own backyard. what they call Asia-Pacific, and their presence in Indo-Pacific strategy will cause them less damage. Forget about China at the moment, but what will be the impact of Indo-Pacific if Russia joins it? That is for Satoru. For Dhruva, there is a question, what will be the implication of US-China rivalry on the Indo-Pacific region? How far perception plays a role in looking at China? President Trump praised Chinese effort till first week of March, but when things went out of control, China is blamed. Is it because of political system that we watch China with suspect, or it is border issues is responsible for the suspicion? For Pankaj, the question is, how is Chinese aggression in South China Sea going to affect its relations with United States? According to you, how is China going to adjust itself with United States in Indo-Pacific strategy? Maybe we can start with Satoru. Satoru, you have to unmute, yes.
Yeah. So about Russia. If Russia joins, most of the country around China has included in the Indo-Pacific concept. So it will make the strong pressure to China. But if Russia will follow their own rule and will not respect the rule of the United States side, Russia cannot join, I believe. For example, their military intervention in Crimea, Eastern Ukraine, Syria, or Georgia did not respect the rule of the US side. That is the reason that Russia is under economic sanction of the US, Japan, or European countries. And indeed, in my view, we cannot trust Russia because we see what Russia has done currently. During the Russia support China, Russia negotiate with the US at the same time. There is a reason that Russia used this measure. Now Russia is under sanction of the US, Japan, and Europeans I have already mentioned. So for Russia, they need to avoid isolation. To avoid isolation, Russians support China and make China stronger. In this case, instead of Russia, the US see China as a challenger. So at the same time, Russia talk with the United States to avoid Russia is the main enemy of the United States. So Russia try to hide behind the US-China competition. In this case, can we trust Russia? I think no. So currently, Japan talk with Russia because Japan want Russia to stop the supporting China. But it is not easy, I believe. That is my answer. Thank you.
Okay. Pankaj?
Yeah, my question was with regard to South China Sea itself. Let me tell you that this phase where Obama was at the helm of affairs, it gave a long handle to China to really build up that kind of islands and all those things. There are two major factors which will be impacting the global order in coming days. First, whether China can be dislodged from those islands or not, or whether China will abide by signing on the dotted lines with regard to code of conduct, then it might really build a confidence in China that, look, there is some aspect which is being played out as such. China's aggression will go again multifold because, again, the problem with the China is that it has a very big house, but a very small yard in front of it. So in terms of maneuverability from purely strategic and military point of view, it definitely would like to hold on to South China Sea. The other aspect which comes to the being is that whether US has the resolve or the willingness to really make certain amends to what it has done in the past by allowing China to really do something like this. Whether there will be more group sales or freedom of navigations and all that kind of things, and really put China on stress, because the amount of deployment of military assets and all those things that the China has done in those islands is of no use if it cannot be used against some formidable adversary as such. Otherwise, these are just these kind of display items as such. The second item which I would like to highlight is that China itself has created a big market of reclamation, big market of reclaiming islands and creating islands out of nowhere. this market will be available to all those islands in South Pacific Indian Ocean. And we have seen this in the case of Maldives, when it reclaimed islands. And the same it is proposing to many of those islands in South Pacific, which are likely to get inundated by water in future itself, which means there will be strategic islands which China will create, thereby jeopardizing what kind of a base politics or that kind of a thing will be played by US or its allies in this near future. In fact, that will be very important concern as such. South China Sea, I think everybody is playing brinkmanship, but who will bell the cat, or I will say who will bell the dragon, is a major issue to be discussed as such. Thank you.
Dhruva?
Hello. On the question of perceptions of China, I think we should take what Trump himself says, particularly on Twitter or in unscripted comments, with a little grain of salt. And so, he speaks still about his relationship with Xi Jinping, he personal equation and all of that. But if you reflect, contrast it, I think, with the comments that he has made, either in scripted remarks or in national security documents that he has endorsed and such. It's I think been a much more consistent line that we've seen even before the coronavirus pandemic. So, for example, the concerns about Huawei have predated coronavirus. That hasn't changed. The speech that he gave in Da Nang in 2017, where he outlined initially his administration's Indo-Pacific policies. So I wouldn't read too much into his throwaway comments that China is doing a good job on coronavirus and such. Why the blame China? I think there is a growing frustration, and this is not just with the Trump administration. This is now increasingly reflected on the Democratic side, and we're seeing, for example, advisors to Joe Biden, who is the presumptive Democratic nominee for U.S. president, taking sometimes an even more hawkish position on China. Biden publicly congratulated Tsai Ing-wen on her victory. They've called out Chinese actions in Hong Kong and Xinjiang. I think there is basically a steadily growing frustration with China that is building up in the U.S. policy establishment on both the Republican and the Democratic side. Where there are differences, I think there are differences in how they think they should go about addressing it. So Democrats, for example, have criticized Trump's pulling out of the WHO and withdrawing from TPP as not the best moves, or that they should actually leading into this competition. They also argue that while Trump is confronting China, he's not doing enough to compete at home, so is not putting in place, for example, better policies for research and development. The debate in the US is now more about how to compete with China rather than whether or not to compete with China. And I think this is just reflective of that. Why blame China? I think it's more for the reasons I outlined earlier: the lack of transparency, the feeling that China does not offer a level economic playing field, that, for example, it heavily subsidizes its industries and making it difficult for competitors in other countries to compete. The lack, of respect for the status quo, and also the erosion of international norms. So I think that those are the broad areas where different countries have difficulties with China. But I don't think so. I don't think that it's completely coming out of nowhere. But China could make things easier by being more transparent in its dealings. So I think that would make, particularly as it becomes an international power. The big difference is that China that was inward-looking pre-2000 or so, the decisions that they made on governance didn't really have much of an effect for the rest of the world. Today it does, and I think that's the real difference.
Thank you. We have another set of questions. Some of the questions are being repeated, so the panelists may ignore that part and answer the remaining part of the question. First, for Pankaj, he raised, what is the future of US left abandoned? What is the future if US left abandoned to Indo-Pacific? Furthermore, Nepal is a landlocked country, so why it is important partner in the strategic idea of development, keeping focus on the true ocean? It's not very clear. Where do ASEAN or Southeast Asia countries stand on the Indo-Pacific? That is for Pankaj. For Dhruva, US has America first policy. India has neighborhood first, and you are aware that China and Pakistan are India's neighbors. Where do American and Indian interests overlap, especially in the context of Indo-Pacific? Similarly, some says America first is contrary to free and open Indo-Pacific as it supports US trade protectionism. To Satoru, the question is Indo-Pacific strategy going to impact China's Belt and Road Initiative? How? Maybe you can start with Satoru.
Okay, I'm fast. Yeah, impact the Indo-Pacific strategy towards China's BRI. There are three impacts. The first is US-China competition. It's a battle. Who makes the rule? If China tries to make their own rules through the BRI, Indo-Pacific will suggest a more democratic rule that is more beneficial for locals. That is first one. And second one is for the developing countries who receive the money from BRI to build the infrastructure, Indo-Pacific strategy or vision will be alternative choice. What happened in Sri Lanka made a good lesson. Because there was no other choices, Sri Lanka lent money from China with high interest rate and create huge debt. Finally, they lost the right to control their Hambantota port for 99 years. So if there is alternative choice, Sri Lanka can check more carefully. And thirdly, the infrastructure projects suggested by Indo-Pacific are workable. Workable is very important because indeed the view from the size of money, BRI is big. However, BRI failed many projects because China's suggestion is not workable. So infrastructure projects suggested by the Indo-Pacific strategy or vision are workable because Japan has a long experience how to make infrastructure. Size of money is not important. Workable is everything, indeed. So I expect that the Indo-Pacific will win as a concept. Thank you.
Pankaj?
Okay, thank you. I have two questions with regard to Indo-Pacific and how Nepal configures into it. The thing is that when you look into Indo-Pacific Economic Corridor, it fuses the two regions together, South Asia and Southeast Asia together, and which technically means it will encapsulate BIMSTEC, BBIN, and all those regional economic initiatives in Southeast Asia. So by default, Nepal will be the one country which will be benefiting from the Indo-Pacific from economic terms. On political aspects of it, I'm nobody to talk about Nepal itself because there are better scholars to talk about Nepal's position on Indo-Pacific itself, because that is the prerogative of a sovereign country like Nepal. But economically, yes, Nepal will benefit because it will bring Nepal into the larger scheme of things in the Southern Asian economic regionalism concept as such. The second question was with regard to ASEAN and Southeast Asia outlook towards Indo-Pacific. If you look into the ASEAN outlook, I talk from the multilateral perspective, it looks into as a converging point where ASEAN acts as a central pivot to address concerns related to ASEAN centrality, as well as subscribing to the concept of Indo-Pacific per se. The one thing which is completely working in the minds of the ASEAN leaders is the fact whether too much subscription to Indo-Pacific will undermine the ASEAN multilateral structure per se as such, which means Indo-Pacific, technically the dialogue partners will be much more at the center point rather than ASEAN taking shape. Now, if you look into Vietnam, Vietnam talks about Indo-Asia Pacific. Indonesia was the one which talked about the Indo-Pacific Treaty. Singapore is not very clear on this aspect of it. And others are really looking into it, whether Indo-Pacific should be the one which they should subscribe to, or there can be a possibility of East Asia Summit regional, which technically Quad plus really, projects it as such with the inclusion of Vietnam, New Zealand, and South Korea together. So whether they can really promote that kind of a East Asian economic regionalism. And in the past also, we have seen the East Asian Economic Community, which was promoted by Hatoyama, and then Kevin Rudd also talked about Asia Pacific Community as such. So there is a lot of churning, but the problem with the ASEAN itself is that they are always looking for the two wings of benefits, either India or China or US and China, and they want to be the center fuselage of an aircraft as such, benefiting from the two wings. Because the thing is that most of the ASEAN nations are smaller powers, and they don't have that much of clout in terms of international power configuration per se as such. So I rest my case over here, and thank you for the question.
Dhruva?
Thank you for the question. And it's a good question. I mean, how does the US and India reconcile some of their policies? The US has, under Trump, has adopted what he calls America First policy. India, I wouldn't actually say neighborhood first is a good analog, but the Make in India program, I think, is somewhat analogous to that, in that it is about revitalizing manufacturing and re-incentivizing manufacturing back to India. And one of the questions, at least in the bilateral US-India relationship, is how to reconcile Indian desires for Make in India with America First. But that being said, I think there's more overlap on the strategic side. I would say, again, there's commonality, at least in terms of the shared concerns. But in terms of what actually they're doing about it, I would say a few areas come to mind. The first, I think, is in terms of connectivity. So there's India has concerns about the sustainability of connectivity, and some of its new efforts are being pushed in that department. And particularly if you look at India-Bangladesh relations, you've seen major, it's the largest destination of Indian foreign investment right now, particularly in infrastructure. So roads, railways, thermal power plants, and with Russia, actually working with Russia on nuclear power plants in Bangladesh as well. Hydropower, of course, in Nepal, ports in Sri Lanka, railroad infrastructure in Sri Lanka that India is financing as well. And so some of that, there's a commonality in US, even though India has not yet signed up formally to the Blue Dot. There's already been dialogue on Blue Dot with India. This is really about certifying. It's about certifying standards for major infrastructure connectivity. So this, I think, is one area where there is certainly cooperation. Although, because both the US and India are relatively are not as good, frankly, in terms of it's a new domain for them in terms of financing overseas infrastructure. Japan and China Japan much more than China, but China as well have much more experience recently with that. So there's still some problems in terms of actual on the ground cooperation between India and third country. So for example, India-Japan cooperation has still been limited. There's some actual evidence of concrete benefits in Sri Lanka. There have been some joint projects there, but still India has not yet been accustomed to working on in third countries with third countries overseas. A second area, I think, is maritime security. This is an area where there's been a major push between the US and India in the last few years. There's a shared concern about keeping the waterways of the Indian Ocean and the Western Pacific open. And so you've seen, for example, cooperation in maritime domain awareness, greater mill-to-mill exercises, information sharing at fusion centers, white shipping agreements. So there's a whole range of activities which India is pursuing independently, where the US is pursuing independently, but where there's a very natural complement between the two. And the third and final area I would mention is tech cooperation, technology cooperation, where this is now the new domain of major expertise, of major competition between powers. So while India has not yet laid out an explicit policy for its 5G, there've been a series of consultations between the US and India on 5G telecommunications. But in this time, despite America First, the Trump administration has actually made it easier for India to access certain technologies with fewer licenses from the US than previously. So again, I don't see this as, I see these as concrete areas of cooperation in the Indo-Pacific between US and India. Finally, on the question of how the US itself can reconcile America First with its free and open Indo-Pacific policy. I mean, I wouldn't go so far as to say America First is pure protectionism. The general feeling is that the US is the most open amongst the major economies. And I think this is both, I mean, there's a very good IMF study that does comparisons of major economies on various aspects of economic openness. And the US is at the upper end on all 10 criteria that they assess. It's really about changing, dialing it down somewhat. So it is a move towards more protectionism, but I still wouldn't say it is protectionist. And a good example of this is the renewed NAFTA treaty, where the US, Canada, and Mexico had this treaty from the early 1990s. Trump felt that the US was not deriving benefits from it, and the Mexico in particular was taking advantage of it. They've now renegotiated and re-ratified a treaty which gives more favorable terms to the US, and for example, now on autos and other things, the US market is now, US industry is now more competitive with Mexican industry. So I wouldn't look at it as a complete reversal to protectionism. It's about renegotiating the terms of American openness.
Thank you, Dhruva. Now, maybe it will be the last set of questions. There's one question for all the three speakers. All of you are a scholar and do not hold any government position. Hence, we believe that you will give a frank answer. Every American official has officially said free and Indo-Pacific is not aimed at China. Do you personally agree to it? Now, the question to Dhruva: how do you look at the role of Australia in Indo-Pacific? Given the deep economic engagement of all Quad countries like China, with China, what is the future of Indo-Pacific strategy? With India also withdrawing from RCEP, what is the future of this agreement? China has emerged within the international system, but there exists China threat across the world. Offensive realism suggests that its economic power can be turned into military power, but in reality, that China does not have any policy how to tackle with the growing power. Again, postmodern President Trump's made it easier by damaging international system. What is the fate of the world? Basically, new world order. Question. It's a very long question. To Pankaj, will the countries in Asia and South Asia be open to cooperation with external actors like the EU or its member states? Second question is Quad 2.0 actually relevant in today's geopolitical dynamics? Because nothing seen or heard about it in last 1 year. To Satoru, there is a question. According to your suggestions, an increase in defense expenditure capability is a good strategy. How do you see the possibility of containing the Chinese economic influence and the infrastructural stakes that it has in many developing countries, which has led it into increase in power? How about the back channel that exists between China and a state like Pakistan, even Israel, North Korea, and so on? There is one more question to Satoru. President Trump's policy failure will further tarnish the US reputation as the most powerful country of the world. It's not a question. So I think we'll end it here with all the comments from all the presenters. Satoru?
Stop, I cannot hear your question. So could you send me the
okay.
Could you
okay.
the question again?
Maybe we'll start with Pankaj and I'll send you the question in the chat.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Pankaj?
Okay, my questions are two. South Asia and Europe. With regard to this institutional mechanism, there is already an institution which is known as Asia-Europe meeting, which comprises near about 40 odd intergovernmental participants. And there is a regular dialogue with regard to building cooperation among the countries of Asia and Europe. So institutionally, this already exists in this regard. The second aspect is that whether the countries will come forward if there are some constructive engagement in this context. I believe it depends on how the connectivity really links to South Asia and the larger Central Asia and all those things together, because invariably you will find that the economic engagement, both through maritime and other overland transport, will be the defining factor with regard to South Asia interaction, more with Europe, which is likely to happen if their connectivity really improves. The second aspect which has been really talked about, and which is particularly with regard to RCEP also, and then following that I will take this Quad 2.0. RCEP, I believe that the problem which is really happening, that India is not getting its due. And this we have seen that most of the reviews, be it the India-Singapore, free trade agreement review itself, SICA review, or for that matter, India-Thailand, FTA itself, India has been more on the losing side. And in terms of services sector opening up under mode 4 and mode 2, with regard to, travel of the skilled labor, there has not much been opening from the Southeast Asian countries. So I believe India will seek, again, its pound of flesh, even if there is some negative balance of trade in merchandise, it should really cover up with the services trade as such. So I think RCEP will be in a cold storage for the next 1 year or so. And last question, which is for Quad 2.0, there is very latent sort of a thing which is happening among the Quad 2.0 members as such, and which is they are really working on logistics support and also, doing joint exercises, group sale. At times India is not a party to it, but are showing the resolve, and they are willing to play the role. And already, with regard to military communication and the encrypted military communication, there is an agreement among most of these Quad 2.0 members itself, which clearly shows they are working, but the progression has been incremental and not much is apparent or visible to the public as such. So I think it's a more of a latent move, which will show that how much potential that Quad 2.0 is there. It will be too early to negate Quad 2.0 at this stage, because earlier Quad 1.0, it was seen that Australia was not a willing participant in this whole scheme of things. Let's see how it really pans out for the future. Thank you.
Dhruva?
Thank you. No, I'll just answer those. So on the free and open, Indo-Pacific is not against China. I would say the correct answer is yes and no, which is, I don't think it is an exclusionary concept. I mean, that's why it is free and open. No, but that's why it's meant to be free and open. So the idea is not to kick China out or anything like that. And this is where I think some of the analysis tends to be too alarmist on this, or too divisive. The idea is basically to incentivize China to play by the same rules. So no one is saying we should not trade with China. You should say we should trade with China on a fairer basis. No one is saying that China should not have a seat at international institutions. It should just be transparent about its decision making and all that. So in that sense, I agree with U.S. officials that it's not meant to be, and the same thing applied to TPP. I mean, this was pre-free and open Indo-Pacific, but the idea behind TPP was to raise standards to a level that would allow the U.S. to compete, U.S., Japan, Australia, Vietnam to compete. And while initially it excluded China, it was open to the possibility of other countries joining on. South Korea would possibly have joined on soon. Thailand as well, possibly. But it was open to the possibility of a China or India joining in the future, as long as it stuck to those standards. So, is the free and open Indo-Pacific driven by Chinese behavior? Yes. So I think a lot of US officials are partly correct in saying this is not directly against China, but partly, of course, I think there's no question that China is a driver behind this. On Australia, we will have today, in fact, this week, we have India-Australia virtual summit. So the prime ministers of the two countries will be talking on a video conference with each other. And the expectations, a number of agreements will be signed, including possibly a mutual logistics supply agreement, which will enable Australian military, the Australian military to resupply the Indian military and vice versa. So that is expected. In terms of, given Australia's dependence on China, I think there has been a recognition for some years now in Australia that there is an over-dependence on the Chinese market. And there's a conscious attempt to diversify away, particularly to Southeast Asia, but also to India, to the US, to other markets as well. And the Australian economy is largely driven by three things. It's resources, natural resources. agriculture exports. And the third is services, so tourism, education, and other services. And in all of those areas, they see India as a very promising market for them. And so the Australian government actually commissioned this India economic strategy that was done by a former High Commissioner to explore how to focus more on the Indian market. So I think they're looking at a diversification strategy. This has been in the works for some years now, but we may see an acceleration of this forward, given the political the political bad blood between Australia and China. Final point, Dr. addressed the RCEP question quite well. I would have given the exact same answer. I just want to touch on the Quad, even though that wasn't addressed to me. I wouldn't agree that nothing has happened on the Quad. In fact, the first ministerial level Quad meeting happened only within the past year for the first time, actually at the last UN summit in September. So it has actually been upgraded within the last year, at least politically. There's also now mechanisms of working level Quad discussion. So in the last year alone, we've had a cyber consultations amongst the 4 Quad countries. We've had a tabletop exercise involving the 4 countries. And of course, there've been other initiatives that include all 4 Quad countries, including the ones that were discussed earlier involving South Korea, New Zealand, and Vietnam. Finally, I think we overlook what is happening amongst the Quad countries as well. So not all 4 of them together, but basically we're seeing a growing level of dialogue and agreements amongst the 4 countries, sometimes bilateral, sometimes trilateral. So for example, you have a US, Japan, Australia dialogue and trilateral cooperation on infrastructure. You have an India, Japan, Australia dialogue that has now met a few times. You have a India, Japan, US dialogue. And then of course the exercises amongst these countries has increased. So for example, even Australia, India, which is the weakest link, they held quite sophisticated anti-submarine warfare exercises in April of 2019 off the Bay of Bengal, off Visakhapatnam. So I actually think there's been an acceleration in the last year of Quad activities across the board, even if it is not always marked in the guise of the Quad.
Yes.
Hello?
Dhruva.
Can you hear? Okay. Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Can I speak?
Yes, please.
Thank you. Okay, there are questions. Maybe there are 3 questions indeed, but the first one, why I suggest we should increase the spending is separated from the economical policy. So, because when China finds a power vacuum, they expand in both maritime and land border. That is the reason we should not create the power vacuum in the military balance. That is the reason we need to increase our defense spending. And at the same time, currently US demand us to increase the defense spending. So this is not just a tough situation, but also the chance for us to increase our defense budget. So that is the reason I suggest we should increase defense budget. This looks like the ship on the flowing river. We cannot resist the flow direction of the flow river. So that is the defense side. Another question is, can we contain China's economic influence? In this case, my answer is simple. If China is not rich, we can deal with. So that is possible if we succeed to make China poor again. That is my answer. And the third one, the back channel is very important when we need to deal with Pakistan or North Korea. Yes, that's true. China has the influence and China can persuade them in some case. That's true. But in this case, case-by-case basis, we can cooperate. Because we can remember what happened in the US-Soviet Cold War. US-Soviet Cold War, in sometimes US and Soviet Union cooperate each other in case-by-case basis. despite they confront each other. So such kind of deal could happen. And that is my answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you. If any of the panelists want to say something towards the end, otherwise we'll end the session. Okay. Thank you, Dhruva. Thank you, Satoru, and thank you, Pankaj, for the wonderful presentation and your time. Indo-Pacific Studies is one of the major research topic of NIICE. So we want all the speakers and participants to contribute articles on this issue for our website. Our next webinar on 8 June, and we have other seminar as well. Please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and join our events. Thank you very much. Good night and have a nice day.